Hey gang, and welcome back to Reality's Edge with Doc and Buddy. We have a really interesting episode today, a fascinating episode based on some investigative journalism done by Dr. Hine, who got a really fascinating witness and got an incredible testimonial, and it's kind of taking us into many directions, and in some ways these different directions may be leading us right to the heart of this whole issue. Doc, would you kind of fill everybody in on this story and everything? And hey, how you doing, pal?
Hey, how's it going, buddy? Happy New Year again. Still
Great to
early.
see you. Happy New Year. I heard
Yeah,
we
well,
got
hi, everyone.
I heard we got
Well,
two of our predictions right so far, even already.
we did. Oh, yes, right. Someone wrote on the YouTube page that a U.S. alleged spy had been arrested in Russia, just something you had talked about.
Yeah, and apparently there's some of the Kardashian information is
Kanye West is
and
a prediction about,
so
having more, another kid or something,
yeah, with Kim and so stuff's happening. We'll see. We'll see what happens.
Stuff's
The future
happening.
will hold.
Yeah.
So you had this amazing journalistic experience and story and met this guy. Tell us or bring us.
So this is what happened. I mean, you remember I interviewed Gary last year, very early last year, the former missile security guard from Minot, North Dakota.
Incredible case.
Incredible case. The guy, I met with him when he was in the Denver area, and I met him through a friend. This friend, someone I've mentioned before, Ron Russell, who introduced me to crop circles, was working, they were working at the same place. And Gary just happened to mention that he had worked. Ron said, what did you used to do? And Gary said, I used to work in the Air Force. And Ron said, well, I seen the UFOs. And Gary, he was burnt by a large craft near one of the missile silos where all the alarms are going up. And he was surprised that anyone was interested in UFOs. So he told Ron his story, and Ron said, you have to talk to Simeon.
It's an amazing story. And wasn't half of his weapon and everything and the vehicle and everything. I mean, and especially it's on the heels of a previous episode of ours where we're talking about the effects of this very thing and how he may even have some brain injuries he doesn't even know about from that.
No, that's right. The whole right side of his body was affected by this radiation. He said it was a brilliant, you couldn't even look at the thing. It was so bright, shot straight up into the air near the silo where the alarms were going off. Everything on the right side was burnt, including the weapons and materials in the security alert truck. And his colleague, Airman Holt, I believe, who by the way, they got separated immediately after this incident, like the military often does with these UFO incidents.
Doc, this is an amazing case, Doc. This is a really amazing major case. It has medical evidence behind it that can be, affirmed. This guy was a security officer. So if he's BSing, he's BSing at a really high level. He's one of the most credible witnesses I've heard in the military.
No, I have his DD 214 number, papers. Robert Hastings recommended that I get this, and Robert Hastings, the UFO investigators, looked at these, UFO nuke cases, and I did see the DD. I have the DD 214, and it does show that he was exactly what he said he was.
It's an amazing case, amazing.
And remember, the VA said they lost his records from the UFO injury, and they still can't find him.
Like Burroughs.
Just like Burroughs, and and he's still suffering medical injuries on the right side of his body to this day. I believe he has had some contact with people that who deal with the medical issues related to contact. And anyway, the case of Gary is so interesting. Terry Lovelace, who I interviewed recently, who I also was on his radio show. He has a weekly radio show on artistfirst.com. And
that was a great interview, by the way.
Yeah. Terry's a great guy. I was really great to make contact with him because I had just read his book, Incident at Devil's Den, about his contact abduction event at the state park in Arkansas
And didn't you
Was
read it while you were camping also?
we did some episodes while I was camping out there, buddy, if you remember. And I was reading it, and I've always felt good every time I've been camping anywhere. So I must have an ET controller, just like David Noble Whitecrow. But Terry looked at Gary's video and he said, "This guy," because Terry worked also before he was stationed at Whiteman Air Force Base. In where was it, outside of Kansas City. Before he worked there, he was a medic, and he had, was around the missile silos. He had an experience of seeing a triangular craft, not a huge one. This was a really interesting story that Terry told us, and it's in the book Incident Devil's Den. And is that they were called out one night for an injury in the missile silo, right? There's like 10 missiles per launch control facility with the Minuteman III, and in the 70s, right? And they're called out one night, and they get out to the silo, tons of emergency response vehicles, and there's this eerie glow because there's so many emergency vehicles with their lights flashing, and they're told not to get out of the Jeep yet. And so what's going on? We're just heard, a guy hurt his leg climbing up the ladder in the missile silo, and they finally get out, and they look, and there's a triangular craft over the silo. I believe it was K5. That was the missile silo. He said it was the size of a bus,
Interesting.
Our size bus, not the huge triangular things we're used to. And it was just hovering there. Everyone had their weapons drawn, but no one knew what to do. All of a sudden, it shoots off at lightning speed, 500 miles an hour from 0 to 5, and is gone. And then they're told later, you guys, that was an experimental helicopter, or it was this, or it was that. And of course, you're not going to talk about it. And that was his first experience. So Terry said, I looked at Gary's, testimony on the video, and the guy totally knows what he's talking about, because I was at the same type of missile installation setting. So anyway, David Noble Whitecrow responded to Gary's video, who he saw it too, and he said on there, I have a story to share. Does anyone want to hear about my experience in the Navy? That was all he said. One or two lines. I said, well, contact me. I'd like to find out, what you experienced. And it turned into these 3 episodes, which people have been watching quite a bit and really enjoying. And he turned, such a fascinating guy. And what got my interest in him was not all the paranormal events that he shared with us. And they are really interesting events, as you've heard in these past episodes. But initially, it was this story about he was on the USS Finch during Operation Dominique. It is something we haven't heard very much about. And David said, you guys study UFOs and nukes and missile silos, but you've never studied Operation Dominique. And I was there. These were nuclear tests, weapons tests of the warheads before they installed them into the Atlas missiles and the Minutemen.
Wow.
They wanted to make sure they worked, right? I mean, and destroy as much as they could, right? I mean, they wanted them to go off and create a lot. So they had these airdrops, and they dropped them from the sky, and they had a Thor missile launcher to test them in various configurations.
Yep.
And they had about 30 of them. Anyone can look it up. Operation Dominique. I learned a lot about tests. They were southeast of Hawaii, down there by the Johnson Atolls and the other islands out there, that were, some of them were just completely, leveled. Anyway, what David said is there were tons of UFOs seen around those explosions all over the place. All of the radar operators were talking about it. It's a typical thing. And in one instance, they were told to get aboard the USS Finch, about 10 of them, stand there and watch what was going to come in. And he said a large cigar-shaped craft, 200 yards long, came kind of listing by, going lower and lower on the left side of the ship. And he watched it go off to the horizon, never heard anything about it. He didn't go in, he said he didn't see it go into the water, but it was getting lower and lower. Then they're ordered to go below deck and strip and go in twos to the chief's office and sign something. They're never going to talk about this. They didn't see anything, the typical NDA that UFO witnesses in the military often are asked to sign. They wanted to make sure they didn't have cameras, and he thought that was the end of it. And I'm really abbreviating it, so you should go back to episode 1. But the main thing is 15 years later at Guantanamo Bay, he runs into a diver who he calls the Master Chief, who somehow they get to be talking, and David says, what story are you talking about? The Master Chief had made reference to some very strange incident. And he said, it was a UFO that crashed in the water during Operation Dominique, and I was ordered to go under the water to investigate. And if you listen to episode 1, it's so fascinating because they lower this guy down, with the ropes and the cables and the breathing oxygen. And he's down there and he doesn't see anything. And he turns around and there's this 200-yard long craft that he was right next to. And he touched it. He said it felt like a jellyfish. And
Wow.
it started pulling his arm in. And then it glowed. And he saw humanoids walking around inside this craft.
Wow.
And he had a panic attack.
That sounds kind of similar to a famous Russian story that's come out in the past 10 years about a craft that crashed into Lake Baikal, I believe it's called. And the Russian Navy swam down and they saw 9-foot-long men. And then they saw a craft and they could see people on the inside of the craft. It seems very likely.
Very similar. That's very similar, isn't it?
These underwater, locations and mountain locations seem to be way stations and holding areas and logical hiding spots on this planet.
Yeah. The interesting thing about this case is that the craft seemed disabled. And David speculated it was the explosions from the weapons testing that were somehow disabling these craft. But he said the Navy brought in tons of ships, even other nationalities from NATO, to try to corner this thing. And one evening in the middle of the night, it just rose up, cast a glow. This is what the Master Chief told him, cast a huge glow over the whole area and just slipped off and they never saw it again.
Wow. You know what? This is also an interesting story because it coincides with what, first of all, we were talking about a few episodes ago, how UFOs are involved in naval exercises, and almost every major naval exercise, international one.
It does, doesn't it?
In years.
You're absolutely right, buddy. Isn't it exactly what we've been saying?
And it also coincides with a tweet that Tom DeLonge put out last week. And that tweet was that he said something to the effect of ask somebody about a submarine that was pinned up against the Atlantic coast, the northeast Atlantic coast, I think it was, by 5 submarines and couldn't escape or something like that. Very interesting stuff. I think we have to start accepting the preponderance of this evidence. I mean, these are...
No, this was a witness none of us had ever heard of before because no one had ever talked to him. And how many other witnesses? The Master Chief said 5 or 6 divers went down after he did, and we've never heard from them. Because when he got to the surface, he was in such a nervous state, he refused to go down, and they threatened to strip him of one of his ranks, his top rank.
He is a new witness. He hasn't been documented before. He's in no books. He's in no other interviews that I'm aware of. You really got exclusive here.
He hasn't sent me his DD-214, but he knows the Navy stuff so impeccably. And he sent me the pictures of him on the deck at Guantanamo Bay and all these other things. And it just shows you, buddy, this hidden history. We're not the first to invent this idea. Other UFO researchers have talked about this. Is there a hidden history in the United States of witnesses like this who've been waiting to talk to us about what they saw, but because they followed their instructions from their branch of the military not to talk?
I think some of the most
they
credible...
never talk.
I think that's the problem with some of the most credible witnesses. The most credible scientists can't come forward and say, I worked on, I saw this, I touched this, I know about this, because it will jeopardize their future work. It'll jeopardize people's perspective of their sanity. And the same thing is true with military witnesses and police, law enforcement witnesses and political witnesses. I bet there are, we have to get these people when they're in their 80s. Because, when you're getting your 80s, that what the F attitude, and you're like,
that is exactly what
you
David
drop
said.
knowledge bombs.
I'm 76, David said, my 1 foot in the grave. I don't care. And you
Yeah.
have to get to that point. I mean, there must have been many witnesses. He worked as an illustrator for Navy intelligence, and this is how he got a lot of information and knew that they knew what was going on, but they weren't telling anybody.
Right.
He speculated a lot of people on the USS Finch, which seemed to be involved with intelligence work, knew about these UFOs, but never said anything. And he suggested to me in episode 2 that every naval ship has a UFO officer on board. Now, it's not an official rank, but everybody knows when you see something, this is the guy you talk to, and they send it back to Washington. So that would be a huge story, buddy, wouldn't it? If some of these people came forward. I mean, we've been talking about this.
I think this is a huge story. This witness is huge. And the implications of this witness's testimony is not just one UFO case. He speaks to a broad range of phenomena. He speaks to...
Well, this is the thing.
It's a big case. This is a big case.
This is why I wanted to talk about it, buddy. People have heard episode 1. I just didn't want to repeat it. But here's what the impact on me has been over the past couple of days. David, I thought we were just going to talk about UFOs and the incident and the diver and, USOs, and David knows a lot about that. But what really impressed me was he had so many other paranormal encounters, and I won't share them all here because you can listen to it for yourself. It's worth going through all 3 episodes. Numerous ghosts and poltergeists. I mean, things flying across the room. And
aports and psychokinesis.
And so much. I'm beginning to wonder whether Jacques Vallée was right. He keeps telling us, I've talked with Jacques Vallée, and I know his message, but I started reading one of his books, The Invisible School, and this idea that UFOs are the tip of the iceberg of this reality, and we're all focused on it because it's nuts and bolts, and there is usually psychic phenomena, and we know this because we've talked about the Colonel Coyne incident,
and we know they're connected. We know
Ohio, and before, and even Stanton Friedman's his co-author Kathleen Martin gave a whole lecture about the psychic experiences that go along with UFOs, and nuts and bolts UFO researchers don't want anything to do with that because they want to believe that these are metal ships coming from other planets, which they might be, but there's other possibilities. That's what Jacques Vallée. And here's the thing, buddy, this is what this episode is about. It seems like these psychic experiences are intrinsically linked to the UFO contact phenomena. Am I right? Or
absolutely, indisputably.
And that's what came home to me with David. And I also watched Hunt for the Skinwalker a couple days ago.
This all ties in together, and I think it's about. And you can call it a bunch of different things. You can look at it a bunch of different ways. My personal belief right now is something to the effect that. Reality can get thinner at some places. And those locations, it's easier to cross the threshold, cross the lineman to that place where everything is connected. The Akashic record, the monad, the source, the motherboard, if you believe this is a simulation, whatever you want to call it. And those places are thinner, and it's easier to cross and get access to that information that you get from ESP that allows you to heal non-locally, that allows you to do psychokinesis, that allows you to do these things, amazing, stunning things that sound crazy, but have been proven empirically by science and studies if you do the research.
No, right.
All these different phenomena, from out-of-body experiences to clairvoyance to a synesthesia that involves psychic phenomena, to ESP, to even shamanic experiences, to spiritualism in the 1800s where they had things levitating and people levitating, even spiritual experiences like, I'm forgetting the famous friar, I think, who was a flying friar, who in like I think the 1500s or something. I think all of these are just different facets because it's on the edge of reality, because it's on the edge of our knowing. It's foggy, and so we don't completely get a clear picture of it. And they seem like separate things, but these separate things are actually just different facets of one underlying structure. And that underlying structure, I think, is the fabric that holds this reality supported.
Yeah.
Underneath our reality, we can go and see other places, or we can use the power of our consciousness to heal someone from a distance, or all the, psycho. This just sounds nuts to people who aren't initiated, who haven't gone through
I
this.
know.
But that's
but
how,
it's,
that's what I believe. It sounds kooky, but
I tend to think you're right, buddy. I think these phenomena are all connected, and we call them paranormal or whatever you'd like to call it. But
here's some of the supporting evidence. There are people who are like these locations, like Skinwalker Ranch. Uri Geller is one of these people who had all of these different phenomena that you talk about associated, from aports to precognition to RV to UFO stuff to all of that stuff around one person. The same thing with Ingo Swann. Even the phenomena of piggybacking, of the phenomena will go with other people. Even people who were exposed to Ingo Swann would say that for the next 48 hours, I had an increased ESP ability, or I had this ability, or I had aports following me home. So I think this thing about thinness, and for some weird reason, it also has to do with black holes. And I think maybe that's also because it's the structure of the universe is thinner at black holes. You know how they've proven that psychic powers are more accurate at local sidereal time at 13.
Right, yes, the sidereal. Yeah, I've seen the evidence for that many times at the URBA conferences. Yeah,
because it seems like the black hole at the center of our galaxy is directly on the horizon. It's a straight shot.
Right.
And maybe that's the largest, thinnest area in our universe where the information can flow the thinnest. So if you're pointing towards it, it can flow faster, maybe, or more clearly. These pieces seem to be coming together. There are other people who are thinking this. It's not just us. There's a lot of people thinking these thoughts.
There are people that want this to be separate from all these other phenomena, right? And I understand it, because our minds like things to be easily categorized and simplified. And imagining little guys and gals coming from other planets, in their metal ships, it's appealing to our science fiction mind. But is there a possibility, buddy, that this is phenomena presents it this way, so we kind of go with it and don't totally flip out because we can identify it from our science fiction? It's
like you say, you can touch it. You can't touch ESP. It's hard to touch ESP. There's a wow.
Weird.
It's it's the nature of how limited our senses are. We evolved on this planet just to be able to perceive what we needed to. So our senses are not big enough to see. We know that the universe, we can only perceive 4% of the universe. We don't know what dark matter and dark energy is and all of this stuff. Our senses are so limited. So we should at least give the possibility of being able to contact or to connect to the universe in more dynamic ways. We should give that possibility at least some credence.
We have to. No, buddy, we have to. You're absolutely right. When you read scientists saying in response to these phenomena, we know all the scientific physics laws, they've all been discovered, and it doesn't allow for this. And we know everything. I just read this a couple days ago. It was a critique of, it'll come back to me what it was. It was something, whatever it was, this physicist was saying, look, we know so much. It was a criticism of, it was someone criticizing ATIP or something like this. And they said, we know everything there is to know. And, it was Andrea Rossi's ECAT. We haven't talked about this yet. This is a sort of cold fusion relative. It's being tested again in January. Andrea Rossi, the Italian inventor.
Yeah, it's an name familiar.
I've been involved with this for years. I've even had some criticism on there when I post things. They say, "Oh my God, this guy believes in UFOs." And then the ATIP thing came out. I said, "Hello," but they were in their box too. But I love the ECAT world. I love looking at this. This is a whole nother topic we will get into about cold fusion, low energy nuclear reaction, all these alternative.
I love it.
Look, we know everything. There's no room for this, blah, blah, blah. And what you just said, buddy, is so true. We don't know what dark energy is. We don't have the slightest idea what dark matter is. Believe me, I read this in Science Magazine. Every week, there's a new theory of the week about dark matter. Is it WIMPs? Is it axions? Which particles? Is it alternative universes? Nobody knows. When a physicist says we've discovered everything, and yet,
Doc,
as you just
think
pointed
about
out,
this.
98% of the universe is unknown because of our
Unknown.
senses.
Yep.
How could you possibly say how could you discard any of these phenomena we're talking about because they don't fit in when we know from plain vanilla physicists that we don't even know something like 92% of the universe, and the remaining like 6% that we know, we can't see that either. So you're left with 2%.
And you know,
we're left with 2%.
You realize that the dual slit experiment, the double slit experiment, is from 1801.
Yeah.
That's when it first came out. And no one to this day, 10, 15 years later, we still really don't know what's going on there. You know, people will say it's evidence that consciousness affects matter, like people in my camp. Other people will say all sorts of different things, but they've tested this to such an extreme. They've done the reverse quantum eraser, dual slit experiment, and tested at all sorts of different stages. And it's indisputable that the universe is created. It leaps into reaction to your consciousness. The universe really is an interactive universe. So
that's observation. That's one interpretation, is that it's consciousness. Or see, this is how complicated it is, buddy. Some people say it's consciousness. Some people say it's just the act of observation, like any diodes that are in the double slit detectors affect where they're going. It's the heart of quantum mechanics is this double slit experiment. And, you know, it wasn't until the 1960s that they could actually look at it at a subatomic scale. The equipment didn't exist.
And one at a time.
Came out, exactly. One particle at a time. And it still came out exactly the way the predictions were, even to this day, is that particles seem to have a wave-like property, and they don't even seem to act like particles unless you're observing them somehow.
And they follow this incredible rule. And they follow it somehow knowing what the other ones are doing. There's all these other implications. And as I forget who was the physicist who said, if you say you really understand, quantum physics, you don't really understand quantum physics. Because basically,
I think that was Feynman. That was Richard Feynman.
He said it far more eloquently.
There's a new book about the double slit experiment. By the writer for New Scientist. I can't pronounce his last name very well. It's Anil Anaswamy or something like this. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, but he wrote a book, Through Two Doors at Once, just brand new. I mean, a couple months old. And I went through it, and he basically, you're reiterating what he said there, which is essentially that it was known about a long time ago. It couldn't be studied at this real subatomic level. You could do it with your own experiments with light and curtains and the way light comes through different substances. But do you want to know how he ends up this book in terms of the most likely explanation?
Of course I would. I've been looking for this solution for,
because nothing really makes sense. And they even found that David Bohm's explanation, where the particle has a wave-like nature, Bohmian mechanics, as it's called.
The pilot wave, it's both simultaneously.
Bohm gave up on it. He was an admitted communist, and he did go to Brazil. But when he was posed some difficult questions by some of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics, he couldn't quite come up with an answer, which they have now. And now they're thinking the Bohmian mechanical explanation is not bad. But the way this book ends in the final chapter was just so exciting to me. He ends up with the many interacting worlds model.
The many worlds model.
Many worlds model. It's actually literally called the many interacting worlds model. He goes into Hugh Everett, the many.
I don't like many worlds
model, but there's a newer version of it which doesn't even involve waves. It involves, and I've talked about it many times. We're not going to go into it here in detail, but it involves parallel realities creating interference patterns with each other that recreate waves. The wave is not the intrinsic thing, it's the outcome of parallel realities. And it was so gratifying to me as someone who spent a lot of time, and I presented this at SSE and everything, to have a book Well, he says there's no explanation. We don't know why the double slit experiment does what it does. And he goes through all the permutations, like you mentioned, and the quantum razor. But the many interacting worlds model, he talks to Howard Wiseman, at the University of Adelaide in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that's the university, who basically came up with this idea that if we sort of abolish quantum mechanics and replace it with a near infinite number of classical realities. No one's saying this is what's actually going on, but it's just interesting that if you assume parallel realities, you end up with quantum mechanics again without the wave function.
Yeah.
And he didn't say, no one's saying this is the way it works. It's just very...
Well, actually, a lot of people are saying that mini worlds works. There's a lot of substantial physicists that do believe in mini worlds.
No, I know. It's.
Here's the problem I have with mini worlds, just really quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just because to me it seems like such a very complicated solution, but more importantly, it requires at every action of the smallest subatomic particle, a new complete replica of the universe is instantly created. That is a tremendous amount of energy and matter to come out of nowhere. Every millisecond, at every subatomic particle moving. So to me, I would think that we would sense that incredible amounts of energy being created next to us in another universe or in another world or something. And that there are probably more likely other simpler explanations.
But there's another, but buddy, that's just one interpretation of many worlds.
Yeah, there's a bunch of them. There's a bunch of many worlds.
That's Hugh Everett, the third kind of, the people that follow that point of view, the many worlds interpretation, say that, our consciousness is sort of going off in these different directions and new realities are being created. But there's another version of it. And this is what David Noble Whitecrow mentioned from listening to one of our episodes of Reality Edge, by the way. In episode 3, he mentioned this, that he listened to our show and that he said what he believed was going on, which is what the many interacting worlds model suggests, is that all the alternatives already exist and your consciousness is just simply moving between the different versions of
a lot of people say that, time itself already exists, determinism,
right.
And all that other stuff, time already exists, and consciousness is just a cursor, telling you where you are. So that doesn't necessarily prove or disprove many worlds, but it definitely reinforces the cursor. I love the whole cursor thing because time seems so irrelevant, especially when you talk about retrocausality, and they're talking about that a lot now in particle physics, where a particle could actually send information backwards in time to another particle when it was close by and share that information back towards the future, and it would seem instantaneous and maybe even like entanglement and stuff. And a lot of people are saying that's the connection for psychic powers, that, retrocausality will go backwards in time to when the things were connected, or in the future, it comes backwards from the future, the information. I don't know, but one of the things that helps to tie up all of these different thoughts, all these different parapsychological effects in ufology and consciousness, is something that Dr. Vernon Neppy came up with, the Gimmel, which is a consciousness field that he has actually done the metrics, the volumetrics for, in several white papers that have gotten it's gotten very good response in the scientific community. And that apparently the math, I don't know volumetrics at all, but apparently the math is very good, and he's done the volumetrics for it with subatomic particles and everything. And
I have to go back for a second, because the objection that you placed to many worlds model, the Hugh Everett model, is what many people have said. Bryce DeWitt, one of the physicists back then who came across his dissertation, said, I don't believe all these realities are being created. If it was happening, I would know about it. I'd experience it.
Yeah.
To which Everett responded, he said, yes, but you don't experience yourself going around the sun right now, do you? Or spinning in the Earth's orbit. You don't feel that physically, do you? To which Bryce DeWitt responded, touche, yes, that's correct. And he actually became a strong proponent of it. But here's the thing, Comrade Budinsky, is that some people do object to this, any idea of parallel realities as being very complicated and it just sort of mind-boggling and so forth. But if you don't accept that, then what you're left with is a disappearing worlds model. It's the opposite of many worlds, is disappearing worlds, which is Copenhagen quantum mechanics, which is essentially that all these possibilities exist in every piece of matter, from the way the quantum wave moves through time.
Mm-hmm.
And you're only perceiving one tiny fraction of it. And when you ask where the other versions go, they say they don't exist. They disappear. So I have to say, I'm not telling you which one to believe because you have to pick it yourself. You either go with disappearing worlds. Where do they go? Or you go with many worlds that they're somewhere, but I'm not experiencing them. Or you take my view, which I'm not saying people believe in, which is somewhere in the middle, which is what we call the paranormal. Are some of those realities kind of coming back? I mean, you have to go one way or the other. So nobody really knows.
You know, it's so interesting how, there's consciousness, and people will say, consciousness is fundamental. Nothing else matters if you don't have consciousness. And people say matter and energy and space-time is all that matters. And consciousness is built out of that. And I am one of those who think that they're interwoven as a tapestry. Matter is meaningless without consciousness. And consciousness is, of course, impossible without matter. And so a universe has this kind of dual feeding mechanism to it, whereby it is so deeply interwoven, consciousness and matter. And that explains how consciousness can interact with all of space-time and can do healing and can explain all these strange effects that we talk about, because consciousness is interwoven in ways that we truly don't understand. When you look at the dual slit experiment, the implications to me and a lot of other things about the universe that seem very simulation oriented, like when you look there, it happens. Essentially, there's a lot of different things in physics that are essentially speak to that. This whole thing seems like a setup. This whole life, this whole universe seems like a setup. And there's definitely structure underneath that our senses cannot perceive. And this structure underneath may be a unifying structure. It may unify a lot of these things that we think are separate. They're just different reflections of the same multifaceted gem. Just the light is hitting it differently at different moments.
Well, I have to bring in here a book that I just started looking at, which is Ray Hernandez book, Beyond UFOs.
I love it. I've got my copy right here.
You've got your copy, and I was fortunate enough to talk to Edgar Mitchell, actually.
Wow.
In Fort Collins when he came out here for a conference. Yeah, so the fundamental idea of all those guys, Dr. Rudy Schilds and Dr. Edgar Mitchell, we all know
Dr. Joseph Burke, who I interviewed,
and many other people, and Ray, is that this is not a separate phenomena, because Ray's experience, I heard him talk about this once in person at Reno when we had a conference out there, a kind of a contactee conference, and luckily I was invited to go there. Some just great contact stories of this beautiful stuff. And Ray talked about his experiences, and they were always, any of the UFO experiences were associated with other really fascinating, for lack of a better word, psychic experiences, appearances of what we, balls of light and entities. And, as you pointed out, even Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ had these experiences when they were working with Ingo and the other viewers at SRI.
Yes.
That book, Remote Viewers by Jim Schnabel, one of the first remote viewing books. Actually, Jim Marr's book was the first, but his publisher wouldn't publish it initially because the government didn't want it to get published. That's why it was delayed. I think Marr's was going to do it in 95, really quick, and the government said, we don't want this to be. But in that book by Jim Schnabel, you were alluding to this before, there were at times a strange, I believe in one of the viewers were together and a crow appeared in the room.
Wow.
And there was another incident where both Hal and Russell were in a hotel room at some conference or something. I can't remember the specifics. You could look it up. And something kept knocking at their door.
The floating arm? Was it the floating arm?
The floating arm and the robot guy that walked into the room and stumbled around like Frankenstein. That's just my memory of it. I mean,
yeah, and there's another one of a UFO going over them, and it just backs up.
UFO going over them. Yes, thank you.
And there's a story, and you hear this around Pat Price. You hear it time and time again. There are locations and places and people that are thin. And if you train yourself and you to a small degree, I have weird stuff that happens around me, but it's not the scale these other people do. Where I have weird airports and weird stuff. I've been fortunate enough to document that. I showed you the ID when I had my ID and it transformed into a female ID, and the guy saw it too, fortunately, and all sorts of really crazy. You've never seen this video and story? It's a story.
I didn't know about this side of you, buddy. You have these experiences too?
Oh, they happen around me all the time. Electronics don't work. Like when I went to the hospital, the first 3 thermometers didn't work. I mean, just time and time again, I had the UFO above me. Right.
I've been around people like that.
And other people, like my head's lucky. If you rub my head, you get lucky. Stupid stuff. It's stupid. We were joking about it, and the guy won. A friend of ours won several $100s. It's just stupid, weird stuff like that. And of course, it can easily be statistical quirk or weirdness and things like that. But different people have those things around them, and I think it's not a coincidence. I think it's because these people are used to that signal, tap into that signal, and at first, that signal. You know, that signal you listen to with RV, but if you work on all the different stuff like I do, it becomes first just like a dirt road, like a neural network. It's a dirt road, and that dirt road becomes a sidewalk. And with more use, it becomes a road, and then a highway, and then a super highway. And before too long, you're your own little black hole, like the center of our galaxy that has a easier transmission of information to the Akashic record or the source or the Lyman or the Gimel or the Jungian conscious meta consciousness or whatever it is. A lot of this stuff makes me think about the simulation theory. Does any of this stuff buy into the simulation theory with you? The whole dual slit experiment, all these different paranormal phenomena, do they?
I have to be honest. I have heard very serious presentations about the simulation theory at the science conferences I go to.
Yeah.
The issue with the simulation is something simulating the simulation. If you get the problem of infinite regression, which is the same problem you have with Copenhagen quantum mechanics, which essentially is if matter requires consciousness to be matter, then do you, as a physical entity here sitting in front of us, require someone to observe you before you're matter? And then who does the observer require an observer? And you get into these infinite regressions.
Fine-tuning of the entire universe, anthropic principle, all of that stuff. It never stops.
Yes, thank you. It's anthropic. So it gets very complicated. And I have to say, I don't really know one way or another. I'm still working on the many worlds interpretation.
Doc, I think you do know. What if it's fractal?
No.
Like everything else we believe, it's constantly fractal. It doesn't have a beginning and end. It's just a perpetual fractal shape that we can't even perceive, but it's fractal. We know that. It has superstructure.
Well, this is something we will be talking about, and I'm going to be recording some videos about this. And this has a lot more to do with the way we treat our environments, and are what we call the phenomena that we call paranormal. Are they the result of ourselves and the way we're interacting with nature in a way we don't understand yet? And we're going to save this for another episode. It's a little too big. And I mentioned it to you this morning a little bit, but this idea of fractal flattening, allowing some of these other realities to come in more than they would have if you had not kind of made things thinner. Because you were talking about thinning, right?
Yeah.
What makes an ecosystem thinner than leveling a forest, damming a river, flattening an area to make roads, which, by the way, are going on at unprecedented rate throughout the planet right now, the number of roads that are being built.
Think about it. Like a rainforest, there's so much entropy in a rainforest, so much chaos, craziness. But we know that it takes tremendous chaos to have wonderful order. To have that statistical wonderful order.
Well said. Yes.
And so when we destroy those rainforests, we lose that wonderful order, those wonderful chances of miraculous things coming together to do incredible stuff. We're losing the miraculousness of our planet.
And this increasing tendency for us to want to micromanage everything, and a much larger percentage of Fortune 500 companies making their living from data mining, which is in itself a type of fractal reduction where you're trying to predict what people are going to do and find these correlations, right? Remove the chaos in consumer behavior and get a better prediction of what people are going to do. I mean, look at these systems. Tim Cook of Apple called it the data industrial complex. He said it operates with a military precision to try to track what you do. There was an article about this in the New York Times just a few days ago where they showed the heat map of New York City from cell phone usage. There's billions of dollars being made of tracking cell phones to find out where people go. Your carriers sell this information, which is one reason why I leave mine in aircraft mode. That's why you can't always get me, buddy. I'm not available unless it's turned on. But
we're in the era of where data is being sold as a commodity.
And it's a type of reduction. It is, and it's a whole nother topic in itself. But what I'm approaching, it's a big topic. I'm approaching here just from the point of view of reductionism. We've all talked about reductionism in terms of science, and my book Opening Minds was about reductionism and mechanistic science and how that kind of didn't take account for the fractals, and that's all true. But the way our businesses operate on now, think of the biggest businesses right now in the internet and computers and social media. They operate by trying to hone in exactly what your preferences are and what you've purchased, and tracking what you do website by website as you navigate across the internet,
and to become addictive and everything.
Fractal flattening. And in my simian view of the world, and I made a video about this a couple months ago about why UFO contact and interaction would continue to increase as long as we keep flattening things. In that view of the multiverse, the more you flatten it here, the more it's going to pop up there, but it's going to bounce back because it's this is just the model of across all the multiverses. There's symmetries.
Yes, there's a balance.
Exactly. So what we call paranormal is actually energy and information bouncing back to us in a totally reconfigured way because we tried to crush the fractals. The fractals can't disappear. It's conserved across the entire system,
I love it.
world.
I love it, Doc.
And this is why we're going to be getting more of this if we keep on flattening everything. The alternative is to deliberately allow more uncertainty into your life. And I'd have to say, I believe Reality's Edge is part of that, because we're not saying we totally understand. We're not trying to explain it away. We're trying to broaden the perspective.
Doc, in an era of censorship, in an era where scientific white papers are held back from people that can save lives, in an era where MIT resources are prevented from being shared with the general public, stuff on sociology and art, not just stuff on proprietary, science or military or national defense issues, where knowledge is being held back from people. It's a glorious time for the transparency of coming to terms with the power of your own consciousness and its ability to tap into whatever we're going to call it. Whatever Mr. White Crow was able to see the reflections of in the many different facets, there's one core thing that connects it all. And as time passes, it seems like we're getting a greater understanding of this thing. And whether we create it naturally, biologically, where we attune our senses to a higher level and everyone becomes more like Ingos and Uris and everyone becomes their own, ranch of their own kind and are able to connect with the universe in a greater way, the universe becomes more transparent. I think as things become more technological and crazy, it seems like the real trade-off, the safety of society comes with transparency, comes with the power of the individual.
No, it's true. Transparency is the name of the game. And I think we talked about this in previous episodes.
As technology gets more dangerous and lone wolves and all that.
But the transparency is the core of Western civilization, I would argue, is increasing transparency to the average person, not just for the elites, but to anybody. That's really what the Bill of Rights is about. How many thousands of years did it take to get to a Bill of Rights? And we can laugh at that and we can be cynical about it, but honestly, we have one, and we can even do this show right now without any fear of being silenced or arrested or censored because we have a First Amendment. But that's transparency, is that it moves in both directions. But the opposite of that is control. And we're seeing that control being exerted on the internet now. By the companies.
They're trying very hard. Governments, everyone.
Very hard, and so this is what we're talking about. So I would say, and this is something, a testable idea, is that the more control you try to exert over any system in the long run, the more you lose control in the long run.
And the more adaptability is evolved. The more you try and restrict a life form, it learns to live with that restriction and find flaws and exploit them for greater.
And a perfect example of it are these superbugs now that are totally immune to our antibiotics, right? You wouldn't believe how concerned biologists are in the medical community about these infections now, which The bacteria, there's no antibiotics left that work. The
Zero.
bacteria
None.
have
Yeah.
evolved faster. Antibiotics is not a particularly profitable business, according to what I read. So the pharmaceutical companies don't really spend a lot of effort developing them. And you can't charge a lot for them. So they're not proprietary in the same way. Anyway, the upshot of this is that the system, it's like the character in the Jurassic Park says, "Nature finds a way." Malcolm, what was his name?
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Nature finds a way. And you know what?
Nature finds a way. And I'm also reminded of Princess Leia in Star Wars. Do you remember in the first episode when she's with Darth Vader and she says, "The more you try to close your fist around us, the more the sand is going to leak through your fingers."
Oh, yeah.
Carrie Fisher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think Carrie Fisher was right. I think in a nutshell, this is what you can't ultimately control it. And anything that tries to do that, do you know what happens when you try to control it? It's just like these antibiotic resistant bacteria. They evolve faster than the control mechanisms, and the control mechanisms won't work in the long run.
Because,
I know, that's my view.
And ultimately, too, in this universe, there's like no perfection, like you can't make something completely sterile forever, because ultimately life in the universe has adaptability and evolution and things like that. And this universe has the mysterious, and that's what makes this universe kind of enjoyable to live in. Reality is okay. But to me, what's really exciting, Doc, is what's out here. Just beyond it, that we're just getting glimpses of on our show. That we're thinking that maybe all these things are together, but that stuff out there, that's exciting to me. And you know what? It's fun to explore, and maybe some of us are a little further out there and are really venturing further than most of society and have a greater understanding. Or maybe we're deluding ourselves. Maybe we're all living in a massive illusion because we only understand 4%. But either way, the journey sure is cool as crap. And I think for the first time, we're legitimately putting together all of these different pieces to this one substructure of some kind. We're finding a name for it. The monad, the Akashic record, the Gimel, all these different things for it underneath the surface, whatever it is. Something's there, Doc. I'm not certain what the physics of it, but
we don't know what it is, but it's all these phenomena show us that it's real, and it's another pathway of communication for energy information that's below the surface. We can't see it. It came up in the Skinwalker movie. You hear Dr. Eric Davis there. He keeps saying science likes things that are repeatable, that are measurable, right?
Yeah.
That have some sort of process that we can observe empirically. And unfortunately, at the Skinwalker Ranch, it doesn't repeat itself. We don't know what we're measuring. It never repeats itself twice. The phenomena are so disparate, but they're sort of related because they're kind of.
You know what I think it's like? I think it's like when you do the dual slit experiment and you shoot one particle at a time and they go boom over here and one goes over there. They don't seem like they have a pattern, but over a long period of time, they have a pattern, and that's what we're starting to see now. All of these things come together. There is a pattern underneath. And when you look at them in isolation, they seem separate. But when you look at the pattern over time, multiple targets in each one of those different.
No, that's true. That's a very good
valleys.
A very good analogy. Very good analogy. You always get that wave pattern, even with single particles. One at a time, they'll still form the interference pattern. And that's what all data shows us too. So yeah, it's a good comparison.
So our next episode is going to be what, Doc? It's going to be how sci and technology relate, how they're increasingly becoming more and more of the same thing.
Yeah, that's a whole good we were talking about this a little earlier. That's what we'll talk about next time. Yes, tune in, folks.
That sounds awesome.
We're going to be talking about artificial intelligence and sci. Buddy and I were having a fascinating discussion about this earlier today, and we decided to stop talking so we could have a whole broadcast about it because it became so interesting, didn't it?
Yeah, technology is becoming magic again, and it's really exciting. And we have an amazing guest coming up in about 2 weeks, or less than 2 weeks. Yeah, a super amazing guest. We've got a bunch of really cool things coming up for everyone. So it's really fun to be on Reality's Edge, Doc. And it's such an honor to be on with you.
You too, buddy. This is so much fun to talk about these subjects. And we appreciate all of you out there your comments, your questions. It gives us ideas for future shows. So if you
Yeah.
haven't done so, click subscribe to either of our channels. And yes, it's down there, right there. Left, right. Okay. And post your comments to this. It's always, we talk about it and it gives us ideas for doing other things. So that we appreciate your participation in all this.
Very much. Thank you guys so much for joining us for another episode of Reality's Edge, and we will see you guys soon, and we'll see if those predictions continue to come true.
See you on the edge.
Thank you.
Take care. See you next time. Bye.